Welcome to this episode of It's Not You, but Sometimes It Is, the podcast where real senior leaders in the C-suite have real talk about the challenges they've faced. This episode is with Stephanie Manzelli, the Chief People Officer, CPO of Employ. We had an awesome conversation where she's just able to be very transparent and real, and we had a lot of fun. Some fun jokes, talked a lot about bad bosses and when we've both been bad bosses, what led to that, how did we try to fix ourselves, and how do we support others? So really fun conversation. Welcome to the episode. Enjoy. Welcome to our episode of the podcast today, Stephanie Manzelli. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
And Stephanie, you are the Chief People Officer at Employ.
I
Yes.
am. Yes.
So can you give us a little introduction to kind of the arc of your career? How did you get to Employ, and what is your role there really? Because what does Chief People Officer really mean, right?
For sure. So Employ is an organization that provides people first recruiting solutions that kind of empower companies to overcome their greatest hiring challenges. And I think that kind of really aligns with our conversation today. My pathway to the Chief People Officer seat, it wasn't linear. It was built on being scrappy and saying yes to the hard stuff and kind of always being deeply curious about how businesses work. I didn't set out aiming for the C-suite. I set out kind of wanting to make an impact and solve meaningful problems and build teams that people, wanted to be proud of. And I started in HR doing kind of a little bit of everything, recruiting, associate relations, systems, you name it, I did it. And over time I started earning bigger seats at bigger tables and kind of being the person who had the ability to connect the dots between the people stuff and the business strategy. And, I didn't wait to be invited in. I asked the questions and I showed up prepared and I delivered when it counted. And I would say that that's really helped me stay close to the business and kind of lead with a mix of head and heart. So yeah, and I would say, Chief People Officer, it's the Chief Human Resource Officer of an organization. So all the stuff behind the scenes that make our teams run.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you. So, and I've heard that a lot when I ask anyone, how did you end up in a C-suite? They all say it's not necessarily what my goal was. I just work hard and I solve problems. I look for problems and I am passionate about solving them. It's kind of a consistent theme.
Yeah.
And you have had to do a lot of hard work, obviously, in HR and talent. You've had a number of different roles. Can you describe one of the hardest things that you've had to personally overcome in a leadership role? And what did you learn from it?
I would say, I think it's a mix of personal and professional. I think, if we just focus on all of the work things that we've had to accomplish, I mean, there's any number of challenges that I could list and kind of how we overcome it. But I would say, honestly, the hardest thing, I've been through is leading a major team restructure during a time of personal burnout. Our business needed a reset, hard decisions, tough conversations, kind of a full rebuild of team norms and leadership expectations. That's where I built my career in sort of transformational leadership. So I love operating in chaos and creating sort of calmness in that. But at the same time, at this point in time in my career, I was running on empty, and I felt like I had to be sort of the steady one while I was quietly struggling behind the scenes. And I would say the thing that got me through it is also what made me a better leader, and that was sort of a mix of honesty and support, and just frankly going back to the basics. I got real with the leaders on my team about where I was at, and I leaned into a few trusted peers, and I really focused on one clear goal at a time so that we could incrementally move the ship versus trying to pull the wheel hard left and get it to where it needed to be. And, what I would say through all of that is resilience isn't about powering through. It's about asking for help and staying grounded in your purpose and frankly, showing up anyway. Because sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that shape the strongest leadership.
Absolutely. So I've talked a lot about the difference between grit and resilience. And I think a lot of female executives who have kids who are caretakers in some way, there's a unique amount of strain on us. And almost every senior leader who's a woman, who's a mom that I have met has hit major burnout because they were confusing grit for resilience, right? It's like, yeah, I can take the punches, go through a lot and show up. And sometimes we need to do that, but that's not resilience, right? Resilience is actually getting creative, overcoming things, setting boundaries, having some self-discipline, and figuring out a way to innovate through something rather than
Yeah.
just taking the hits, right? And when we take hits over and over, we're gonna burn out.
100%. I could not agree more.
And sometimes you just have to be that person that's not burnt out in front of everyone else. And we've got to protect ourselves and keep our flame lit in order to be able to be that when it's needed. So,
100%.
your specialty is this transformational leadership. You can come into a situation where there's some friction, drama, lack of alignment, whatever it is, right? And somehow you're able to see what's really going on, what needs to shift. Culture is incredibly important, and they say it eats strategy for breakfast, right? We have all these great goals. Everyone knows their role, their job, and then the way that we're showing up is what holds us back. So, can you give us an example of your experience in developing these high performing teams? What have you had to shift and even fix on the culture side in order to get a team to be truly aligned?
Yeah, I love that. I think I've seen that phrase play out more than once. It's part of why I love this sort of space. I would say, as you were talking, one example that stands out was, during a major transformational initiative at a previous company, I can confidently say that we had a solid strategy. I mean, it was well researched, it was aligned to market trends, it was backed in data. But, early on, it became really, really clear that parts of the organization weren't actually engaging with it. And I don't think it's because they didn't understand it. I think it's because they didn't trust it, or frankly, the leaders that were driving it. And the issue itself wasn't the strategy, it was the culture. We hadn't invested enough in building psychological safety and ensuring that people felt heard, or even in creating sort of a shared sense of ownership. And so once we diagnosed that, we were able to pause and address it. And so, what we did was we opened up two-way communication. We involved the teams earlier in the decision-making process. We realigned the incentives to the value, and we saw a huge shift in the adoption of it. And I would say the strategy landed differently because the culture could now support it.
Mhm.
And I think that's critical. And so, yes, I would say culture sets the tone for how strategy is received and adopted and executed. But without the right cultural foundation, even the best strategic plans, they fall short. And I would say, when culture and strategy are aligned, that's when I would say performance really takes off. But you have to be in there asking the right questions and diagnosing the challenges and, kind of lifting your head out of the weeds and having a holistic view of it. Because I think oftentimes we can look through our own myopic lens if we're not able to kind of look holistically at the problem and solve each of the various parts. We're never going to get there. We're never going to be able to shift the culture to be able to kind of get that strategy
Mhm.
accomplished.
I think, yeah, a lot of people have had work experiences where the goal is set for them and they don't understand the goal. And actually, the goal is shallow, not meaningful, not representative of their true value. And they know that, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yes.
they're told, here's where we're headed, but they're not given the why. And they don't see
100%.
their own personal link of how is my contribution going to lead to this, right? And
100%.
we don't realize that. We just assume everyone gets it, right? And we're a little tone deaf sometimes when we're up here in the sky creating this market strategy.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not uncommon for me, even at the ELT table, for me to say, like, we are talking past people, right? Like,
yeah,
we've got to explain to them in layman's terms what this means, or we have to connect the dots. People don't get, if you're not in finance or you're not in the C-suite, people don't get, financial acumen training. They don't understand what EBITDA really means, or how you personally impact it.
right, right, yeah. And some people don't want to know So I used to assume a lot, well, they're not interested in understanding some of the financial stuff, but there is some level of it that is very important to people, right?
Yes.
Those updates on how are we doing? Are you part of a winning team and are you helping to create that win? They need a certain lens, right?
Mhm.
And the only way you're going to know what they need and want is to get really deeply curious
Totally.
about what's going to help them to just care more and realize that their energy is worth it. Right?
Right. Yeah.
So there's often disconnect between senior leaders, or especially C-suite, and what's happening on the grounds. And sometimes we learn how we should lead in a senior leadership role by watching other people mess it up. Right? So, can you give me an example of what you've learned from a bad boss or a bad executive that you've experienced?
Oh, I honestly, I think we've all had terrible bosses in our experience. I would say, some of the clearest leadership lessons I've had have come from watching what not to do. Early in my career, I worked for a leader who made every decision in isolation, and there
Mhm.
was a very little transparency, no real collaboration. Feedback was treated kind of more like a threat than a tool for growth, and I think it created this culture of fear where people focused more on staying under the radar than
Mhm.
doing kind of bold or creative or life-changing work. And what I would say I learned from that is that the importance of trust and shared ownership. I now lead with a high degree of transparency. I do frequently invite diverse perspectives into decision making. I make space for feedback, even when it's hard to hear. Because to be honest, the goal is to create an environment where people feel empowered, not paralyzed. And I think empowerment and accountability are two sides of a very important coin. And if you can empower people, I think you create a better product because honestly, at the end of the day, great leadership isn't about having all of the answers. And I hardly have all the answers. I would say it's about creating the conditions where the best answers can emerge. And sometimes that happens with multiple perspectives. It's funny because just this morning I thought about something over the weekend. I pulled one of my leaders into a conversation. I said, I just want to download what I was thinking over the weekend. And I want you to tell me, like, where does this fall on the Richter scale, right? Is this a crazy idea? Is this a smart idea? And I just like want 100% truth. And if it's a 6 out of 10, I'm okay with that. But anything less than that, we should really recalibrate this. And she did. She was like it, here are ways that you can plus it. And why don't you send it over to me and I'll kind of refine it. And that was great because if I had gone forward with, what I planned, it wouldn't have been as great as it could be with another person thinking through it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you honor them by asking their perspective, right, and getting their input, first of all, the outcome is always better, but they're going to be more engaged. They're going to be more empowered. They're going to care more. They're going to know that you trust them.
Yes.
And that's the key. So
I completely agree. I do completely agree. I feel like, and that's where the most growth and development happens, right? Because as a leader, our goal at the end of the day is not just to do excellent work, but you're creating leverage for yourself. You're lifting yourself up. You are able to think more strategically, and it creates these development pathways for people to think about new and innovative and unique ways of doing things. And to be honest, that's the goal.
yeah, like if you ask the average person, how creative do you get to be at work? How much do you get to innovate and solve things and do things your way and make them better, right? The average person is going to say not very much because they've got a boss who's just kind of standing over them,
That's right.
wanting them to do everything the way it's always been done,
Yeah.
because it feels safe. And the only time that we can actually get creative and innovative and solve things is when we feel safe, when we're calm,
Yeah.
right? And we feel trusted and told, go ahead and, I got your back. Go ahead and try this. So you can't even access creative thinking when you're in a low grade threat response, which is what a bad boss creates. It's just
100%.
low grade threat all day. And people's brains shut down a little bit. They can't get creative.
Yeah.
So on that note, some of the bad bosses that we've all heard of, had, talked about, our family members have had, a lot of them are unknowingly, and I know they don't want to do this, but they're creating that stress and threat in those that they lead. And then they get frustrated, like, Why aren't these people more creative? Why aren't they empowered? Why aren't they solving problems? Why aren't they pointing out when a mistake happens, right? And it's because they don't feel safe. So, can you tell me what you think makes a bad boss, right? They don't want to be, and sometimes they don't know they are. Sometimes they kind of do, right? And they justify it. So, what makes a bad boss, and are they fixable?
I really love this question because it's complex, right? I think that all of the three things that you listed, right? Sometimes they don't know, sometimes they do, and they can justify their behavior. It's true, though. And I would say, to me, a bad boss isn't somebody with just tough expectations. I would say it's somebody that like truly lacks self-awareness or just doesn't listen or leads through fear or ego instead of sort of trust and purpose. And I would say, it's the leader who centers themselves instead of the team, or somebody who avoids accountability, or frankly ignores the human side of performance that I would say defines a bad boss. I would say that to me is what a bad boss looks like, and that can be multiple different use cases depending on your specific experience, whether or not it's fixable. Yes, I would say yes, but only if they want to be fixed. I would say, I've seen leaders make huge progress when they're open to feedback and willing to do the work. But I do think that it starts with building emotional intelligence and kind of understanding how their behavior impacts others.
Mhm.
Because of the seat that I sit in, I do a ton of coaching. I do a ton of leadership coaching. I do a ton of executive coaching. And people have to be coachable. They have to learn to communicate with clarity and with empathy. And they have to have self-reflection, because if there's no self-reflection and there's no willingness to change, then I would say that that's harder. At
Mhm.
the end of the day, leadership is a choice, and you have to want to grow into it or with it. I will say it to my team on a regular basis. I think I've said it on company meetings. I believe that we're all clay, which means we're constantly moldable until we're stuck in a kiln, right? And we are just constantly moldable. And so you have to be willing to change and grow and evolve and learn.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it's fixable.
Well, Stephanie, it's not just your guess, it's all the science backs you that people are changeable and evolving constantly, right? But I think we do have this idea in our heads that, oh, you can't change people, right? Or you can't change people, so change people. You're not going to fix that boss, so fire them and replace them. But I personally have helped a lot of bad bosses to
Yeah.
see that and understand what's happening and to care about changing and then to change. But they have to
Yes.
care to change, right?
They care to change. And
Yeah.
I would say, like, some of the hardest lessons we learn in our career are the things that change us, right? Like, I'm sure there are many leaders that I have worked alongside and that I adore that were fired because they made a mistake, or they were not leading well. And that taught them to do something differently, right? And so that was a really big learning moment for them. And they evolved, they grew, and they're some of the best leaders I know today.
Yeah. Yeah. And frankly, I wasn't the best leader. There like it took me years to figure stuff out through trial and error and hurting people's feelings and coming off as tone deaf and just not being very aware of how I was coming off to other people. And I'm fixed pretty much. I don't suck anymore. I'm still working on excellent leadership. But we can all change once we become aware of how, and really it's sort of that understanding how I'm actually perceived versus what my intention is.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and you need feedback. And that's why, what you said earlier about you create intentional space for people to give and receive feedback because
Yeah.
we're hesitant to do that. And no one wants to give negative feedback to their boss or anyone in authority over them. Unless
Uh,
you ask, you're not going to get it. Right.
I do. And I do ask, this one prior organization, I created sort of this leadership development curriculum. And one of the modules was on asking for feedback. And it
Hmm.
was focused on teaching leaders how to, because you want to get the most out of it, right? You don't want it to be surface level feedback. You want to be able to create sort of the psychological safe avenue so that people will give it to you freely, in micro doses. Or frankly, you can have a dedicated conversation to say, how could I have done this better in
Right.
leading you or leading this initiative? And I would say that was one of the most impactful modules. And it is hard. There is an art for a leader to be able to sit in front of a direct report or an audience of people and say, give me feedback and be honest about it. Cause that's how I grow too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the scariest things you can do. I remember I read the five dysfunctions of a team with my executive team. And during that process, I said, okay, we're all going to sit down and we're going to write the one thing that each other does that derails the team. So you all have to write down on a little piece of paper what I do that derails us. And we're all going to give that feedback to each other. And we all sat down
Visual
and
exercise.
yeah, I mean, I went hardcore and like, I believe in this trust stuff and I need this feedback, but you all need it too. And we're all going to do it for each other. We're going to give each other this gift of saying, what do you do that derails us? Right. I
Yeah.
remember I was telling another CEO that I did this with my executive
Yeah.
team, and he was like, "You're freaking crazy. I can't believe you did that."
Did
Because
you have like a psychologist on staff? I've done that at companies that we've brought in somebody that like if you needed to step away, you could go have a minute and that's a lot. That's
yeah, well,
great.
and I have a background in psychology, so I
Okay.
felt pretty confident that I could facilitate that, and that,
Yeah.
and I went first. I took all the feedback first and kind of modeled how do you take that feedback.
Yeah.
And it was a pivotal moment for us, but it's something that, my colleague who's also a CEO probably had a more normal response, which is that's crazy. I would never want to do that, right? Because people are afraid of what's going to happen when they
Yeah.
get or give feedback because a lot of people don't have the emotional intelligence to hear it.
That's right.
And so we've had bad experiences with it, right? It's not that we don't value it, it's that we don't have confidence in our skills in doing that. But it's the only way we gain self-awareness and stop being that bad boss.
100%.
So my next question is the toughie, Stephanie. Okay. So sometimes we're our own worst enemy, and you've already been very self-reflective for many years and tried to look at where you could grow and improve. So can you share a key moment when you've had this realization where you're actually in a battle with yourself, an old mindset, a belief, a habit, a trait? What did you learn and carry forward from that experience?
Oh, yeah, I've absolutely had these moments. I said I would say one that stands out is probably really early in my executive career. And maybe to some degree, I still feel this from time to time. The pressure to always have the right answer.
Mm,
At the time, I thought being a strong leader meant that you were an expert in the room, you had certainty, you were solving all the problems quickly. But that mindset backfired quickly. I was unintentionally creating dependency rather
mm,
than capability, and I was missing opportunities to kind of let others step up and lead. And
mhm.
eventually, a mentor pulled me aside and said, your team doesn't need a hero, they need a guide. And that was different for me because I hadn't seen that modeled before, right? Like I thought, here I am, I've achieved all these great things and everyone's looking at me and I've got to have it all together all the time. And that feedback hit me really, really hard because I realized that I was leading from a place of insecurity, not strength, and that read to other people, right? And so I would say since then I've worked to shift from being the problem solver to being the space maker. The one who asks the right questions and kind of sets the vision and really lets others shine. I think it's made me a better leader, and I would say I think it's built stronger and more resilient teams. I think sometimes growth means letting go of a version of yourself that you thought you had to be.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't want you to think I have it all together because there are times that I still get my imposter syndrome. The difference between me now is I lean into it in a way that I acknowledge that it exists. I give it space and then I work through it and I lift my team up as much as I possibly can and let them solve the tough challenges.
I love it. I love that advice you got. But your team doesn't need a hero, they need a guide. That's pretty profound.
It
And it's
is.
just what you needed to hear
It's
because you
what
were
I
trying to
needed to
be a hero.
hear.
Yeah.
It's so true though, right? It is true.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Stephanie, if you could get into a time machine and go back 10 to 15 years ago,
Mhm.
other than this learning moment, right? What advice would you give yourself?
Okay. If I could go back. So many things, about everything, right? Skincare is probably where I'd start. But just kidding.
Me too, I think. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. If I knew then what I know now, I'm just joking. I would say, if I could go back, I, in all honesty, I would tell myself to keep being scrappy and keep showing up and don't expect anything to be handed to you. You earn it every step of the way. I would say, there were definitely moments in my career where I was underestimated, often, right? And I would, when people would make assumptions about what I was capable of, it would frustrate me. And yeah, that lit a fire under me. And I had to work harder and I had to think sharper and I had to keep pushing, even when the odds weren't in my favor. And there were times where I was just so tired and I just was like, this may be not the thing I want to do, or I want to give up. And I would just remind myself that grit matters as much as talent or as much as pedigree, and that resilience, or that picking yourself up or figuring it out and being innovative and staying in the game is often the difference maker. I back then I wasn't always the loudest in the room. I'm not now either, but back then I definitely wasn't. But if I keep delivering and if I keep learning and if I don't back down, people will notice. And I would say, this isn't just to me. I would say this is to every young person or earlier in career person. You don't just deserve a seat at the table. You have to earn it, and you earn it every single day. And it doesn't just happen because you've been in a role for 2 years and it's time to move up to the next role. It's earned, and it's earned every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the world of work, right?
Yeah,
I'm, that's kind of the laws of physics when it comes to work. And a lot of people weren't given, the right home environment and upbringing to understand the value of that. And it's been a hard lesson for a lot of, especially young leaders, right?
yes.
I've put in my time, so I should be
Yeah.
promoted. It's like,
Yeah.
well, but you're not giving us more value,
Yeah.
right? So,
Well, at a leadership level too, though, the converse of that is exactly true. Like it's also challenging, right? Is trying to help people navigate that. For me, it was just so inherently. I mean, I grew up in the military, right? I had two military parents, and to this day, my bed gets made every day. But resilience and grit was a thing we did, right? Like my grandparents were Italian immigrants. It's just a thing, and it's different. It's different now, and so how do you teach that when it was something that was so ingrained in you? And that's the struggle. And that's why I'm so passionate about what I do, is because I have to find new and unique ways for things to resonate with people to get maximum value.
yeah, yeah. And I think inherently people do care. They do want to be a part of a winning team and they want to grow and develop. We're all hardwired to be
Yeah.
able to do something meaningful. We want to do something meaningful and we want to get better at things just intrinsically. So if it, I always say, like, actually our brains are wired to be successful in a work environment and a team environment. But most of what makes us not successful, it really is bad leadership, is leaders not understanding what people need.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
sounds like
Placing
you've got
respect.
that, you've kind of cracked that nut, Stephanie, which is rare. Unfortunately, it's somewhat rare, but it's been such
I
a
hope my
pleasure.
team thinks that.
I know. When the podcast comes out, we should all call Stephanie's team, see what the real deal is.
Yes. Yes. I think that's a great idea.
But thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing your time and your hard-won wisdom with us, Stephanie. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Thanks.